Hello, this is Dillon from King's College London. Uh, I'm going to talk about links between science, education, and the environment with a particular focus on social justice in the sort of urban school context. Just a bit of background, I was trained as a chemistry teacher after doing a degree in chemistry and taught in London schools, high schools for 10 years before joining King's back in 1989. And since then I've been working on teacher education and then researching in classrooms and in schools, museums, botanic gardens, inside and outside for many years. Um, I'm going to start off by just looking a little bit at some a review of the research that we did. So slide number 2 is a review that we were commissioned to do by a number of charities who were concerned that they didn't have enough evidence to support their contention that what they were doing was good value, and that there wasn't enough evidence that outdoor learning was adding any value to what was going on in schools, because that was a common criticism, that there was no real evidence. So we got together a group of people and looked at the 150 studies in the end, which matched our criteria for validity and reliability. And we found that there was, as we said in a small quotation there, substantial evidence that if it's done well, adequately planned, taught effectively and followed up, indeed outdoor field work in particular, but outdoor education offers learners a chance to develop their knowledge and skills in ways that add value to what goes on in the classroom. And at the time, the research really had focused only on measuring those outcomes of knowledge and skills. And I think people began to realise that not only did it do that and did add value to what went on in schools, but it also had a number of other impacts to do with how kids felt about each other, how they felt about themselves, their self-efficacy, their relationship to their appreciation of the relation between urban areas and the outdoors, and a whole range of other impacts. And in fact, as many of you will know, if you take 30 urban kids outside on some environmental activity, you'll have 30 different outputs, 30 different impacts. And so people are now researching what the breadth of those impacts, rather than focusing on a narrow range of impacts, which you might do if you were focusing on researching learning indoors. So, we think we're in a stronger position now than we were 10 years ago, that there's substantial evidence to justify outdoor education, particularly for urban kids. And we also think we know what works. We think we know what good practice looks like in terms of pedagogy and, to some extent, assessment, although assessment is something that we're still trying to get to grips with in terms of understanding what effective assessment is of learning out of doors. So if we move on to the third slide, which has 4 photographs, 3 of which are from the Edible Schoolyard, which is in Berkeley in California. And it's been going for a long time. Many of you know it's one of the first, if not the first of its kind in the US. And the bottom left shows you, some of the interesting exhibits and strategies that they use. It's a periodic table of the vegetables, which is a nice twist on the periodic table of the elements. The top right, you can see the facilities they've got to do artwork and to grow and develop and turn their food, the crops, into things that kids can eat. So it's a great resource, and every school should have one, but the sad truth is that very few schools have got anything like this. It's attached to an elementary school and has tremendous grounds for growing crops, growing plants. The bottom right isn't from Berkeley. It looks more Asian subcontinent, but it's actually from the centre of London, from the East End of London, in fact, where there are a number of community gardens, city farms. This is one of these community gardens, and there are a lot of ethnic minorities in the UK, many of whom are fairly recent migrants, and they have come from countries such as Bangladesh, Pakistan, India, and those families have a rich history, agrarian history, a rich history of growing plants in their own original home country, and these spaces, these community gardens, allow those people to use the skills they've got to grow a range of crops with which they're more familiar, and to develop their skills to use the skills that they thought they probably would never use again, and to show the younger generation that their parents have got skills that the kids themselves haven't yet developed. So this network of city farms, community gardens, does a great deal across urban areas to integrate and develop the knowledge and skills of a large number of the people who live in the city. So turning to the next slide, it's the next door to that community space is a city farm, and you can see some of the kids from local schools who come to learn more about the animals, to milk the goats, and to have some interaction with domestic fowl with larger animals, so they can begin to see what the link between the food that they have on their table and the living animals, as well as the plants themselves. So the benefit to them is that you get to have a sort of a rural experience, but actually in an urban context. And they're normally supported to some extent by the local authorities, but often by public subscription or by donations from philanthropic organisations or by other charitable work. So this network exists, and it's been going a long time in London and to some extent elsewhere. But other examples of interesting pedagogy, slide number 5 shows a resource developed by Michael Holland from the Chelsea Physic Garden. It's a small botanic garden again in the centre of London. And what he's done is to show kids that it's possible to grow tomatoes in a tomato can. You can grow corn embedded in a Kellogg's Frosties carton. You can grow apples in an apple, and it just shows kids, illustrates to kids that all these things are plants. And he starts off his sessions with kids who come for a half day or a day session. Say, how many of you had plants for breakfast? And these kids laugh and say, well, none of us. We don't eat plants. And then he says, well, how many people had tea, and how many people had coffee? How many people had toast, and where did the toast come from? It's made from corn. And how many people had cereals, and how many people had an apple or an orange? And they begin to realise that, of course, that they eat plants. We couldn't live without plants, and it just brings home a very simple message in a very straightforward way. So you don't need a sophisticated, high-tech suite of resources. You can teach kids about the links between plants and animals and their food very simply, very straightforwardly. So that the pedagogy to environmental education pedagogy doesn't have to be complicated to be effective. So moving on to the next slide, slide 6. One of the issues, particularly in urban environmental education, is that we depend often on charismatic individuals. On the left-hand side, you can see a teacher in an elementary school in southwest London, and on the right, a guy who was one of the key figures in a botanic garden, a place designed for schools in Bremen in Germany. And I was talking to a colleague today at Cornell who referred to these people as the cheerleader teachers. They're the people who you go into school and everyone says, oh, you should go and talk to this person. They're the person who gets it all going. And that's the interesting phenomenon, really, as to why it is that it all comes down often to one person rather than the whole staff. It's frequently the case you've got one charismatic teacher, sometimes supported by the school administration, sometimes not. And why is it sometimes, if you go to one school just across the street from a school like this, nothing's happening, whereas 50 yards away a lot is happening, and it can't be to do with anything maybe apart from maybe just how individual teachers and their interpretation of the curriculum and their view of what they're actually limited or not limited to do. We'll come on to that later on as to what the difference is between the schools that do and the schools that don't. So moving on, in terms of what works, slide number 7, what you've got on the left-hand side is a typical Victorian-era London school. This particular school is completely surrounded by roads. It's in an island of roads, And originally the school playground was nothing but hard surface, that sort of tarmac you can see. Gradually the school has evolved and developed its the green space, but again it's an unusual school rather than sort of normal one. More schools tend to have the eco groups. You can see the sort of eco group stuff on the right hand side, and it becomes embedded in the school improvement. It becomes embedded in the curriculum. And it's the sort of thing that we know works. The question is, why do some schools do this and some schools don't? Slide number 8. You've got one of our least green areas of London, Islington, in North London. It has very little green open space, but again, you can do quite a lot with it. Here's an urban environmental education centre. Visited by schools, paid for by charities and to some extent the local authority. It gives kids an opportunity to experience a lot of biodiversity in a very concentrated space. In the bottom right, a school in southwest London, and you've got the using the outdoors, valuing the outdoors as a place for people to cool off and develop their personal relationships as well as their knowledge of plants and animals and so on. So there are good examples of people using the environment, using the outdoor space, using local spaces very effectively. But again, this question is, why is it some schools do it and some schools don't? Again, slide 9. Many schools, it's very common in the US elementary system, particularly, to have school gardens, and people have looked at the fairly limited evidence of how effective these school gardens are. And I talked before about what are the impacts of environmental education in urban contexts. So here's someone who's done a study looking at 338 youth who've been involved in school gardening programs, compared with their before their involvement in this innovation. They were now consuming more fruit, more vegetables, and taking part in more physical activity. In another study, the first grade students in schools who got a vegetable garden were more likely to taste vegetables than students in a control school that didn't have a vegetable garden. There was still some selectivity. It wasn't all vegetables. Kids can be quite picky, but they were definitely, on average, ate more vegetables or were more likely to taste vegetables than the schools who didn't have school gardens. So that's another kind of impact that we probably wouldn't have dreamt about 10 years ago. And schools are improving. There's controversy over what in the US you might call charter schools, as to whether they are equitable or doing good things. In the UK we've got academies, and the same argument's been made about our academies selecting kids or specialising or creating an unequal environment. But there are examples of good charter schools and good academies. Top left is a relatively new school in the north of England, which has got tremendous facilities, tremendous resources, completely unlike those Victorian schools you saw earlier on. The bottom right, in an urban area of Denver, the Odyssey School. It's one of a group of charter schools, and probably one of my favourite school that I've ever visited, because of the focus of the whole school on the what they call the learning journey. So moving on to slide 11. So the learning expedition, as they call it, involves kids at all ages, all grades of the school, going on some sort of outdoor experience. It starts off with elementary kids, the lower grades going off for a day trip, and gradually as the kids get older they go off onto residential experience. But wherever you look in the school, what's on display, what's in the curriculum, has some relevance to these journeys, to these expeditions. So these are not just add-ons. The learning expedition is an integral part of the entire education process. And you see a rather nice display which compares two different sources of a burger, and the one that's been treated with a whole range of chemicals to prolong its life is still okay, and the one that hasn't been treated with chemicals is naturally decayed away. So it makes people stop and think, and it's that sort of, again, simple pedagogy, important message. But it's not all, not everyone's in favour of school gardens or in terms of environmental education. There are people who think it's a retrograde step for a whole series of reasons. Here's a story from 4 years ago of the Atlantic. It's How school gardens are cheating our most vulnerable students, says Caitlin Flanagan. Why is that? So it says, imagine as a young and desperately poor Mexican man, he made the dangerous and illegal journey to California to work in the fields with other migrants. There he performed stoop labour, picking lettuce and bell peppers and table grapes. What made such an existence bearable was a dream of a better life. He met a woman and had a child with her, and because that child was born in the US, he was made a citizen of this great country. He will lead a life entirely different from yours. He'll be educated. Now the child's about to begin middle school in the American city whose name is synonymous with higher learning, as it's the home of one of the greatest universities in the world, Berkeley. On the first day of sixth grade, the boy walks through the imposing double doors of his new school, stows his backpack, and then heads out to the field, where he stoops under a hot sun and begins to pick lettuce. And she goes on, this cruel trick has been pulled on this benighted child by an agglomeration of foodies and education reformers who are propelled by a vacuous, if well-meaning ideology that's responsible for robbing an increasing number of American school children of hours they might otherwise have spent reading important books or learning higher math, attaining the cultural achievements, in other words, that have lifted uncounted generations of human beings out of the desperate daily scrabble to wrest sustenance from dirt. And by an agglomeration of foodies and education reformers, I think she means us. And here we are with the edible schoolyard, which we saw earlier, and the thousands of similar programs. The idea of a school as a venue in which to advance a social agenda has reached rock bottom. This kind of misuse of instructional time began in the progressive era, which merits capital letters for some reason, and it's been employed to cheat kids out of thousands of crucial learning hours over the years, so that they might be indoctrinated in whatever the fashionable idea of the moment or the school district might be. So I sympathise if you deal with people like this. You might think of how you might respond if someone came up to you and said, "Have you read this article?" But I'm afraid the evidence suggests, from research evidence suggests, that the impact of spending instructional time on growing and other activities is far more valuable maybe than some of the time they spend in the classroom, and certainly adds value to that time. So turning to this issue of social justice, particularly in cities, the UK has a population of about 60 million now, and there are 3.5 million people living in poverty. So effectively that's over 1 in 4 children who are living in poverty. Poverty is defined in many different ways. In essence, you haven't got enough money to live a decent life and have all the things that you actually need to get by. That counts as poverty. Some parts of the world it used to be $1 a day to live on, but in urban areas, in the developed, more economically developed countries, it's defined as the amount of money you need to just get by and have the basics. But it's more than that. It's actually serious concentrations of child poverty in local levels. So in 100 local wards, districts, I guess you might call them, up to between 50 and 70% of kids are growing up in poverty. I was talking to a head teacher, a school principal in an elementary school close to the college, a couple of years ago, and she said, even the politicians are sympathetic to urban kids. They just don't realise how poor these kids are. And in some ways, it's poverty which is the biggest issue, rather than access to education. If we could cure some of the issues of poverty, then we'd be well on our way to improving the education of kids and improving their overall life. And in fact, if you're a family in work, it doesn't necessarily mean that you're guaranteed a route out of poverty. 2/3 of kids growing up in poverty live in a family where at least one member works, even despite a minimum wage. It's not enough to get kids out of poverty. So just because your parents work doesn't mean that you don't live in poverty. So what can we do to address issues of poverty? To some extent, the environmental education, as well as teaching people knowledge and skills, may help them to develop the ability to get by on less, or the ability to get most out of life, to go beyond living in a poverty-stricken existence. So Natural England is a government organisation, and I was commissioned by them to look at the social and economic benefits and barriers of environmental education, of learning in the natural environment, as they titled it. So this report's available online. It's free. And one thing we did was to look at the the traditional barriers that teachers or school leaders will come up with in terms of, why don't you take kids outdoors? Why not engage in environmental education? And the sort of traditional things people say, oh, well, the cost of transport is high, there's lots of health and safety issues, it's difficult to get teachers to cover lessons because they're not very good quality, these people who come in and cover lessons when we take kids outside. The curriculum's too full, there's not enough good centres. There's a problem with this argument, though, because there are schools next door where kids will go outside and will get taken on visits and will use the local environment, the outdoor play areas in their schools and the school gardens. And they must face the same issues. They must face the same cost of transport, the same health and safety regulations, and the same curriculum. So those reasons there, I don't think are the real reasons. I don't think that's why people don't go outside. I think it's down to other factors. And the other factors, I think, just moving to the next slide, showing the health and safety. I think there's lots of myths about health and safety. There's lots of myths about the cost of transport. There's lots of myths that stop people using the outdoor environment. And if you go on slide 20, you'll see what I think those barriers are. And I think if you're focusing on thinking of ways to get more teachers to use the outdoors, more schools to use the outdoors, part of the problem is what teachers think of the nature of their subject. If you think that science teaching has to be done in a laboratory, you're less likely to take kids outdoors than if you think science is all around us. If you think the role of education is to train people to get jobs, then you're less likely to take kids outside. If you see the role of education to give people access to a better life, then you're more likely to take kids outside. If your view is the effective pedagogy is it's all about speaking clearly and spelling well, and you'll treat your kids differently than if you think effective pedagogy is getting kids to have hands-on experiences in the wider world, and so on. There's a whole list there of factors which I think are the things that separate the teachers that do from the teachers that don't, the cheerleader teachers from the teachers who don't engage. And if you're focusing on engaging those teachers, we need to address those issues and change teachers' views of the nature of their subject and the role of education, rather than think of ways to make transport cheaper or to think of how to reduce the curriculum. Because those, I think, are the real barriers that separate those who do from those who don't. And the point here is this slide 21, this disparity opportunity, this difference between the kids that do and the kids that don't is particularly tragic. The most disadvantaged pupils have the potential to gain most from this transformative impact that outdoor education has for many young people. That is, that it's the kids who are in the poorest areas and the poorest families who would benefit most from this access to the outdoors, to environmental education. Those inner city kids who deserve so much more. Slide 22 is one of my favourite slides. It's back to the same school in the East End of London, surrounded by roads, and here there are kids from a whole range of backgrounds, proud to get involved in school gardening. The local supermarket has given all the kids a set of gardening clubs and some tools, and you can see a photographer in the background from a local newspaper come to take pictures of kids involved in a growing club. So it doesn't take a lot of effort, it doesn't take much support, but you can transform kids' life very easily. And again, every school should be doing this, but we know that not all schools do. The final thing, just been writing a paper for the journal Science with some colleagues who we put together the handbook of research on environmental education. What we've been looking at is the notion of integrating science and education and the environment. Science education has grown up since the 1950s and 1960s to focus on preparing people for careers in STEM, and it's shied away from engaging people with issues of values and citizenship. Environmental education has gone in an opposite direction, really. Environmental education, which took off in the late 60s and 70s and has grown ever since, has focused more on the social dimension, and they've continued to grow apart. And what we're arguing in this paper really is we've got to sort of bring them together, that if we're going to have an impact on changing the nature of school education, particularly for kids in urban areas, we've got to focus on bringing together science education and environmental education. One way to do that is by focusing on the things like citizen science, support where kids get involved in local environmental issues and local environmental projects, So they learn some science, but they're also realizing that science has links to the local community as well as an abstract subject that you study in order to make progress and gain qualifications. The question is, though, slide 24, what counts as citizen science? Is counting eggs in a nest box or measuring the pH of roadways, is that citizen science, or is that just being a citizen technician? What is it about? So if we're going to have citizen science, let's at least make it proper science rather than simply being a zero-paid technician. And slide 24 gives a list of what might be thought of scientific skills and processes. And those are the things, if we're going to get kids to be scientists in the community, then they need to engage with those whole list of scientific skills, critical thinking, look at the relationship between science and uncertainty, look at the historical development of scientific knowledge, the role of creativity. All those things really should be things that we're going to develop through citizen science if it's done well. And there are some examples where people really get involved in that, in developing hypotheses and testing them out as in a community project. But often the case is that they're just involved in collecting data for the benefit of a small number of scientists. And there's examples of that. Here's an example from a journal on slide 26, the Neighbourhood Nest Watch Programme, participant outcomes of a citizen science ecological research project. And you notice the only names of the people on the paper are the people who coordinated it. There's none of the people there are the people who went out and collected data. The citizens disappear and they don't become regarded as actually having contributed substantially to the paper, even though they're the ones who went out and got all the data. Slide 27, Galaxy Zoo. It's a nice idea. It involves people trying to work out what are spiral galaxies or smooth. Again, people generally don't get any credit for this. They're just doing the work of scientists and don't get much, if any, credit for it. So is this fair? Is this equitable? And the answer is I don't think it is. If we're going to have citizen science and community-based science projects, let's do it properly and involve people and give them credit. So, covered a lot of ground in the last sort of 25-30 minutes, but I hope you've got a sense of how I see the relationship between environmental education in an urban context and issues of social justice. And with a bit of luck, you'll get access to some further reading, and the reports I've shown will be made available to you. So thank you for listening.